Before he could decide, Olivia took another step forward. "No need for a recess, Your Honor. I'm ready to proceed, unless you'd like to dismiss the case entirely." A bold challenge, a direct hit. Caldwell's grip on the gavel tightened. He could feel the room watching him, waiting, judging him in the way he had judged countless others. But this was different, because no matter what he did next, he had already lost. For years, he had spoken, and others had listened. Today, he had been the one forced into silence. The weight of his choices, his biases, his rulings, it all pressed down on him in a way it never had before. The faces of the many people who had stood before him over the years, their stories ignored, their truths dismissed, flickered through his mind. And for the first time he saw them. The realization hit him like a blow to the chest. His heart pounded. His breath grew shallow. "Your Honor?" Olivia's voice was calm, controlled, but she was no longer asking for justice. She was demanding it. Caldwell swallowed hard. He could rule against her, cling to his authority, and ignore everything that had just happened. But the damage had been done. The courtroom had seen behind the mask. And even if he ruled against her today, the world had already taken her side. Because the truth had been spoken. And once the truth is heard, it can never be silenced again. His fingers trembled as they hovered over the gavel once more. But this time, he wasn't sure if striking it would end anything. Because this wasn't just Olivia Carter's battle. It was a reckoning. Judge Caldwell's fingers hovered over the gavel, but for the first time in his career he hesitated. The weight of his past rulings, his unchecked power, and the eyes of the courtroom pressing in on him made it impossible to simply proceed as if nothing had changed. Because everything had changed. Olivia Carter stood unwavering, her presence filling every corner of the room. She had not only spoken truth, she had exposed a system, peeled back its layers, and revealed the ugly reality that had been hidden in plain sight. And now she stood waiting, not for his permission, not for his mercy, but for justice, real justice. Caldwell cleared his throat, but the strength in his voice was gone. "Ms. Carter," he began, but stopped. How was he supposed to speak with the same authority he had wielded moments ago, when the very foundation of that authority had been shattered? His mind screamed at him to fight back, to remind this woman who was in charge, to reassert himself as the ultimate power in this courtroom. But deep down, he knew. His power had always relied on people accepting it without question. And today, Olivia Carter had asked the question he couldn't answer. A long pause stretched between them, the entire courtroom holding its breath. And then Caldwell did something no one expected. He exhaled, slow and controlled, and set the gavel down. Not slamming it, not demanding silence, just setting it down. He faltered again, gripping the edges of his bench as if grounding himself. Then, finally, the words came. "The charges against Ms. Carter are dismissed." Gasps rippled through the courtroom. Even the prosecutor, who had spent the entire trial seated in smug anticipation of an easy win, looked up in shock. The clerk blinked, fingers hovering over her keyboard, unsure if she had misheard. And Olivia. She didn't move. She didn't gasp. She didn't cheer. She already knew this was coming. Because the truth had been bigger than any ruling Caldwell could issue. The judge shifted uncomfortably in his chair, the weight of his decision pressing down on him. His ruling might have dismissed the case, but it didn't erase the truth Olivia had exposed. It didn't absolve him of the years he had spent sitting behind that bench, handing down decisions laced with bias. He met Olivia's gaze, and for the first time there was no smirk, no condescension, no power play, just the eyes of a man who had seen the truth too late. "This court is adjourned," he murmured, and with a final hollow bang of the gavel, it was over. But for Olivia Carter this wasn't the end. It was only the beginning. As she turned, walking toward the exit, the murmurs grew into something louder. Applause, a slow, steady clap from the back of the courtroom. Then another and another, until the sound of it filled the air. She had not just won her case. She had won something far greater. She had won the fight for truth. And as she stepped outside, feeling the sun warm her skin, she knew that this moment would ripple far beyond these courthouse walls. Because today, justice had not just been served, It had been reclaimed. Caldwell's jaw tightened. "You're dangerously close to contempt." Olivia's lips curved into the smallest, knowing smile. "No, Your Honor. I am dangerously close to exposing you." The silence that followed was deafening. For the first time in his career, Judge Caldwell felt the weight of his own judgment pressing down on him. Every ruling he had made, every time he had cut someone off, belittled them, sentenced them with indifference. He had believed himself untouchable, protected by his position. But now, as Olivia Carter stood before him, unshaken, unapologetic, he realized the truth. His power wasn't being taken from him. It was crumbling on its own, and there wasn't a thing he could do to stop it. Judge Caldwell's mouth opened, then closed. The words he needed, the ones that could salvage his authority, reinstate his control, refused to come. The courtroom no longer belonged to him. It belonged to the truth. And Olivia Carter stood as its messenger. The weight of the moment pressed into his chest. The people in the room weren't just spectators anymore. They were witnesses. And worse, they were believers. His authority had always been absolute because people believed in it. But now they believed in Olivia. She let the silence linger, let it press against the judge like an invisible force. Then, her voice cut through the heavy air, sharp and unwavering. "For years, you've ruled from that bench without challenge. You've passed judgment on people who never had the chance to speak their truth. How many times have you smirked at someone like me, knowing the system was built to silence us?" She took another step forward, her presence filling every inch of space between them. "But today, Your Honor, the system isn't protecting you. Today, the truth is louder than your gavel." The judge's fingers twitched, desperate to wrap around something solid, something real. His gavel, his robe, anything that could make him feel powerful again. But none of it worked. He felt exposed, as if Olivia had stripped him bare before the entire room. Murmurs spread through the crowd. Someone whispered, "She's right." Another nodded, their arms crossed, eyes locked onto the judge with something different now. Doubt. Caldwell saw it. He felt it. And for the first time in his career, he felt something worse than anger, worse than indignation. He felt fear, a lifetime of control, of absolute power, and now it was slipping away like sand through his fingers. He could dismiss her, threaten her with contempt, even try to have her removed, but none of it would erase what had just happened. Because she had already won. Slowly, Olivia exhaled, then turned her head slightly toward the crowd. "This courtroom has never truly been about justice. Not for people like me." She looked back at the judge, her eyes locking onto his with finality. "But today, we changed that." The room was no longer silent. It was alive. People shifted, a hum of realization passing between them. The truth had been spoken, not in whispers, not in secret, but boldly, for all to hear. Judge Caldwell swallowed hard. His authority was slipping, his kingdom crumbling. And then, in a final act of defeat, his hand moved, almost involuntarily. The gavel came down. But this time, it wasn't a symbol of power. It was an admission of loss. The gavel's sharp crack echoed through the courtroom, but it carried no finality, only the hollow sound of a man who had lost everything he thought he controlled. Judge Caldwell kept his eyes on the polished wood of his bench, refusing to meet Olivia's gaze, refusing to acknowledge what had just unfolded before an audience that would never forget. The room didn't settle. If anything, the energy shifted again. The crowd no longer mere spectators, but witnesses to a moment that felt larger than just one trial. The balance of power had changed, and everyone felt it, including Caldwell. He inhaled sharply. "Ms. Carter," he began, his voice strained, trying to force authority back into it. "This is still my courtroom." Olivia tilted her head, studying him. "Is it?" A ripple of murmurs followed her words. Caldwell's face twitched. He had never been questioned like this, never had to defend the authority that was simply granted to him the moment he donned that robe. But now, the robe felt like a weight instead of armor. The prosecutor, who had remained mostly silent throughout the exchange, cleared his throat and shifted in his seat. "Your Honor, perhaps we should take a recess." Caldwell barely heard him. His mind raced. If he took a recess, he would be admitting weakness. If he continued, he risked losing what little control he had left. Olivia Carter stood firm, her eyes piercing through the man who had spent decades passing judgment from behind his elevated bench. The air in the courtroom was thick with an unfamiliar energy, one that Judge Caldwell had never felt before. It wasn't fear. It was accountability. A slow, deliberate breath filled Olivia's lungs as she took another step forward. Her voice was even, yet powerful. Your Honor, history remembers those who abuse their power, but it also remembers those who stand against it. Which one will you be? The murmurs in the courtroom grew louder. Someone in the back whispered, "She's right." Another nodded. Even the bailiff, standing rigid by the door, let his gaze linger on the judge, waiting to see what he would do next. Caldwell's jaw clenched. This wasn't how things worked. He dictated the pace. He dictated the outcome. But Olivia had flipped the script. She wasn't here to plead for mercy. She was here to hold him accountable. "You are dangerously close to contempt, Miss Carter," he warned. But his voice lacked the force it once carried. Olivia didn't flinch. She had been silenced before, dismissed, ignored. But this was different. This time, the world was listening. "Contempt?" she repeated, tilting her head. "Is that what you call it when someone refuses to be humiliated? When someone demands fairness?" She let the words sink in before continuing. "Tell me, Your Honor, if I were someone else, someone who looked like you, would you be this quick to call it contempt?" A hush fell over the room. No one moved. No one dared to breathe too loudly. Caldwell's lips parted slightly, but no words came. He blinked. His mind searched for a response, an escape, something to bring order back to the chaos unraveling before him. But there was nothing, because she was right, and everyone in that room knew it. For the first time in years, Judge Caldwell, feared, respected, and unchallenged, felt small. The weight of his past rulings, his biases, the countless faces that had stood before him and never had a chance, it all came rushing back. The weight of his power had never felt like a burden until now. Olivia held his gaze, unwavering. "You think power comes from sitting behind that bench," she said. "But real power comes from truth. And right now, Your Honor, you're running out of places to hide from it." The courtroom was no longer his domain. It was hers. Judge Caldwell's fingers twitched as they hovered over the gavel. It was his last defense, the only thing still tethering him to his authority. One sharp bang, and he could demand silence. One ruling, and he could pretend none of this ever happened. But would that be enough this time? Would anyone listen? Because right now, they weren't looking at him the way they used to, with fear, with submission, with the quiet acceptance that his word was final. They were looking at Olivia Carter, and they were waiting. A bead of sweat rolled down the judge's temple. But he ignored it, trying to steady his breathing. His voice needed to be firm, controlled, but when he spoke, it wavered, just enough for Olivia to hear. "You are walking a fine line, Ms. Carter." Olivia didn't step back. She didn't apologize or shrink beneath his warning like so many before her. Instead, she took another step forward, closing the distance between them in a way that wasn't just physical. It was monumental. "I am standing exactly where I need to be." The words cut through the courtroom like a blade. Judge Caldwell's throat tightened. He could feel the shift in power, the unraveling of everything he had spent decades constructing. The rules had always been simple. He spoke, they listened. He judged, they accepted. He decided, they obeyed. But not today. Today, Olivia Carter had shattered the illusion. "I have watched men like you," she continued, her voice steady, unwavering. "Men who believe that a title grants them the right to diminish others, that a bench makes them untouchable, that a gavel makes them a god." She shook her head slowly. "But here's the truth, Your Honor. You are not untouchable, and your power is not infinite." A sharp inhale came from somewhere in the crowd. The prosecutor, who had been silent for most of the exchange, shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his fingers tapping against his notepad. Even the court reporter, usually expressionless, had stopped typing. A bead of sweat glistened on his temple as he cleared his throat. "Ms. Carter," he began, voice measured, though the edge of impatience was hard to miss. "This is not a debate. This is a court of law, and you are expected—" "To what, Your Honor?" Olivia interrupted, her voice still composed, but now carrying the weight of generations behind it. "To sit here and accept whatever narrative you craft for me? To allow you to strip away my dignity under the guise of legal procedure?" A murmur rippled through the courtroom. A few spectators exchanged glances, some nodding subtly in agreement. A young black woman near the back straightened in her seat, her eyes wide with admiration. An older man folded his arms, watching intently. The weight of history, of every time someone like Olivia had been silenced, sat heavy in the air. Caldwell's fingers tightened around the gavel. He had ruled over countless cases, had sent men and women away with a simple bang of that wooden hammer. But at this moment, he had no control. Not really. Olivia wasn't following the script, wasn't playing the role he had laid out for her. His lips parted, ready to issue a warning. Maybe even hold her in contempt. But before he could speak, Olivia took a slow, deliberate step forward. "Your Honor," she said, softer now, but no less powerful. "Do you know what it's like to walk into a room and feel invisible? To be judged before you even open your mouth? To have your intelligence, your integrity, your very existence questioned, not because of what you've done, but because of who you are?" Caldwell blinked. He opened his mouth, then closed it again. The silence that followed was heavier than before, pressing down on every person in the room. Even the court reporter had stopped typing, her fingers hovering above the keys. For the first time, the judge didn't have an immediate response, because this wasn't about courtroom protocol anymore. This was about something deeper, something undeniable. And everyone in that room knew it. Judge Caldwell's grip on his gavel tightened. His knuckles whitened as he attempted to summon the authority that once came so easily. But something had shifted. Olivia's words had reached a place within him he wasn't prepared to confront. A slow, uneasy shuffle spread through the courtroom as people glanced at one another, sensing the imbalance of power. This wasn't the way things were supposed to go. The judge was supposed to be in control. The defendant was supposed to shrink, to falter. But Olivia Carter stood steady, unwavering, a force greater than the man who towered above her in his high-backed chair. He cleared his throat, an attempt to regain control. "Ms. Carter," he began, voice laced with forced composure. "This is a legal proceeding, not a place for personal grievances or social justice speeches." Olivia tilted her head slightly, her eyes studying him. There was something behind his words. Fear, maybe. No, it was deeper than fear. It was the struggle of a man watching his carefully constructed world crumble, brick by brick. She took a breath, measured, full of purpose. "And yet, Your Honor, this courtroom has long been a place where personal biases have shaped verdicts, a place where justice is not blind, but selective." Her voice was calm, but each word carried a sharp edge. "So tell me, do you truly seek justice today? Or simply compliance?" A gasp rippled through the audience. A reporter in the back raised his pen, scribbling furiously. A defense attorney at another table smirked, as if entertained by watching Caldwell squirm. The judge shifted in his seat, eyes darting to the court officers by the door. He had options. He could hold Olivia in contempt. He could demand order. He could try to break her. But something told him none of it would work. Not today. His hesitation was all Olivia needed. She stepped closer, her voice lowering, but no less powerful. "You've sat in that chair for years, handing down rulings without a second thought. How many people have stood here, right where I am, with the truth on their side, only to be silenced by the weight of your gavel?" The room felt smaller, the walls closing in. Caldwell inhaled sharply, but his chest felt tight. His own words, his past judgments, they all seemed to hang in the air around him, pressing in, demanding to be acknowledged. He glanced toward the prosecutor's table, seeking some kind of anchor, some way to regain control. But even the DA avoided his gaze. For the first time in his career, Judge Caldwell wasn't the most powerful person in the room. And Olivia Carter wasn't finished. The judge's robe suddenly felt heavy on his shoulders. His once commanding voice had lost its edge, and no amount of gavel banging could reclaim the authority slipping through his fingers. The room no longer moved at his command. It moved at hers. The judge smirked, his voice dripping with racism, ready to put this black woman in her place. He thought he had all the power. But the moment she opened her mouth, the courtroom gasped, and within minutes, everything flipped, leaving even the judge begging for a way out. The courtroom was tense, the air thick with expectation. Rows of wooden benches creaked under the weight of spectators leaning forward, their eyes flicking between the defendant's table and the towering judge's bench. The dull hum of whispers floated through the room like distant thunder before the storm. At the center of it all, Judge Matthew Caldwell sat, a smirk tugging at the corner of his mouth. He wasn't just a judge. He was a man who believed in his power, in the weight of his gavel, and in the idea that certain people needed to be put in their place. And today, that person was standing before him, Ms. Olivia Carter. Olivia, a black woman in her early 40s, stood at the defendant's table with an air of quiet dignity. Her dark brown skin gleamed under the harsh courtroom lights, her natural curls framing her face like a halo. She wasn't just here to defend herself. She was here to stand up for something much bigger. But Judge Caldwell? He saw none of that. To him, she was just another woman who needed to learn a lesson. He cleared his throat, his voice slick with condescension. Ms. Carter, do you even understand the charges against you? The smirk, the deliberate emphasis on Ms., the way his lips curled as if he found amusement in her very existence. The courtroom's energy shifted. Some exchanged uneasy glances, others folded their arms, waiting for the inevitable humiliation. Olivia lifted her chin, her deep brown eyes locking onto the judge's, with an intensity that silenced the whispers in the room. She refused to let her hands shake, though the weight of history pressed down on her shoulders. Yes, Your Honor, I understand them perfectly, she said, her voice steady, clear. And I intend to address them accordingly. Caldwell chuckled, shaking his head. Oh, I don't think you do. You see, this court doesn't operate on feelings. We deal in facts, in evidence, in truth. He leaned forward, relishing the moment. And the truth is, women like you think you can walk in here and… A sharp intake of breath echoed in the courtroom. The unspoken words hovered in the air like smoke. Words he wanted to say. Words they all knew but wouldn't dare repeat. Women like you. Olivia's fingers curled into fists for a brief second before she released them. She had been here before. Not in this courtroom, not in front of this judge, but in moments just like this. Moments where she was expected to shrink, to bow her head, to submit. But that wasn't who she was. Not today. Not ever. Your Honor, she said, her voice unwavering. Are you suggesting that I don't belong here? That I don't deserve a fair trial? The courtroom held its breath. The judge's smirk faltered. For the first time, uncertainty flickered across his features. Barely noticeable, but Olivia caught it. He had expected her to stutter, to shrink, to crumble. Instead, she was standing taller, pressing forward like an unstoppable force. She wasn't here to play the role he had written for her. She was here to rewrite the entire story. And that was just the beginning. The courtroom had never been this quiet before. Even the walls, lined with years of echoed verdicts and gavel strikes, seemed to be listening. The silence wasn't just an absence of noise, it was charged, expectant, waiting to see what would happen next. Judge Caldwell shifted slightly in his chair, the leather creaking beneath him. His smirk had vanished, replaced by something else. Annoyance? Number something deeper. It was the first crack in the foundation of a man who had built his career on unquestioned authority. Olivia had done something he wasn't used to. She had confronted him, not with anger, not with defiance, but with the power of unwavering truth.